apps and specs and how they interrelate and how they connect. So it's a lot of detail. We're not, as you can see, sorry, there's going to be a lot of detail we're going to go through. We're going to walk through this with you guys, so hopefully we can get started. But we got to kind of time box it because we only have 45 minutes. We do want you guys, we do encourage questions. We do want you guys to ask questions throughout. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we can stay on course as well because there's going to be a lot that we're going to go down.
So if you do have something that's burning inside of you that needs to get out, put your hand up and we'll do our best to answer it. If it's one of those long-winded answers or the it depends, we might save it for the end.
And also, hopefully, we're going to stay in context to where we're at, or we'll bring it to another section. Okay, so let's go into it. So my name is Adib Janani. I'm a senior agile coach with Agile by Design. This is?
I'm Tyler Motherwell. I'm also a senior agile coach with Agile by Design based out of Toronto.
So unfortunately, Jeff Anderson was not, I know he's on the programs and everything else, he wasn't able to make it today because he has pneumonia. So we got Tyler, so even better. All right.
A little bit taller, so just better, I
think. All right, so let's go into it. So problem statement in general, like the most common challenges for any initiative is communication and alignment, all right, within teams, hands down, all right? So let's do a little bit of a test right now. For example, what does the word customer mean to you? Someone raise their hand.
What's a customer?
Someone who pays for all the software.
Sorry?
Someone who pays for all the software.
Nice.
Sponsor.
Sponsor?
Anyone else?
One who's using the software?
Nice.
Okay.
The person who's using our product.
Person who's using our product?
Okay.
Cool.
So we actually asked our client what they thought. And we actually asked from 3 different views. From a business view, so it was a financial services client, so they said, it's the relationship with the representing person, their entity, and their holdings. Okay, that's from a business view. From a technology view, they said it's the unique identifier attributed to their account of the individual entity and their attributes. Okay?
Very, 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 very different views, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, in here we have one that is essentially a relationship. Here we have one that's essentially just give me a unique identifier in a table and all of the data that's associated with it. Right?
Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything.
Otherwise,
they don't exist. They don't exist. And then, from an operations view, it's the person on the other side of the phone who hopefully has the right to talk about that account.
So depending on who you ask, a customer is going to be something very, very different with very, very different attributes and things that they do in order to provide value to us as the business.
So going back to the problem statement, within teams, you're building software, you're layering on complexity, you're going through all of this. And within your team, there's natural communication gaps because everyone has their own angles, their own views on what they're doing. We're going to address that. We're going to look at the different elements that we've used in our practices to be able to help with that. Okay? So, today, the plan for today, we're going to walk through 3 practices, we're going to use 1 example, and we're going to speak about our own experiences in applying and connecting them.
So we're not going to go quite as, so we're going to give you guys as much as possible a kind of a cursory understanding of kind of the 3 fundamental practices, story mapping, modeling, and specifications. However, we're not going to go super, super deep into the mechanics of each one. We do want to give you enough that, hopefully you can follow along, but there may be some follow-up homework that you guys may need to do in order to really kind of put the pieces together. So the 3 practices we've got up here: story mapping, domain-driven design, and specification by example. Hands up if you're familiar with story mapping. You've done it with a client. You've done, okay, so looks like about half. How many have taken a crack at creating domain models or using domain-driven design?
Or CRC
CRC modeling, yeah. Okay, a pretty good amount. Hands up if you've taken a dabble with specification by example. Okay, about the same. So just to make sure, some may have 1 or none or even all 3. What we want to do is create a common level set for everybody, just so everyone knows when I say story mapping, what am I talking about? When I say domain-driven design, what am I talking about? If I say Spec by example, what am I talking about? So user story mapping, right? So I think this is the one that most of the people in the room know most about. This is the one where we can logically break down system behavior into a sequential series of events, right? It gives us that two-dimensional backlog, it gives us that unit time, and helps us see our product end to end.
Domain-driven design, also known as like a ubiquitous language between business and technology, right? But it also goes down to the level of the interconnected relationships between those concepts.
So if we think back to that example of a customer, domain-driven design is where we really dig into and define what is a customer when it comes to our system and in our sphere.
So the alignment of that customer between business and tech, so they come to a conclusion of what that is, but then the interconnected relationship of what the next domain would be. So going towards like an agreement or a contract, whatever the term is that they want to use, they align to agree upon that and the direction towards that and the relationship between them.
So, okay, if that sounds like a lot, don't worry, it's going to become really, really clear once we start drawing a picture. A picture's worth 1,000 words, right?
Hopefully it will become clear. All right, and then specification by example. So also known as behavior-driven design, defining stories or features or epics through plain language, using real examples, okay? So it usually illustrates the preconditions, the trigger, and the result in a structured format for you to be able to actually build through.
So the purpose of specification by example is instead of saying that the field must be alphanumeric, you would say that I'm going to have this kind of input that's non-alphanumeric, and this is the behavior I then expect in that scenario. So it's really breaking down your system behavior into those specific scenarios.
Okay, but let's go into it.
Yeah, it's gonna get fun stuff.
So for this, the example that we're going to go down is that we're a telecommunications company and we are looking to create a new teen choice plan, right? For new teens, and they're going to have 500 voice minutes, 3,000 text messages because they don't really talk on the phone; they actually just more text, and then a gig of data because they need to learn boundaries. They can't go to like unlimited.
Any parents of teenagers in the room? Okay, yeah. We got a fair amount.
Yeah.
Is this anything close to what you guys have for your kids?
Yeah.
How many are there? Sorry?
3,000 texts a day.
3,000 texts a day. Yeah, that's probably pretty close to accurate.
Well, some are data actually go through. But anyway,
yeah.
So we're a telecommunications company. We're a little delusional. We think this is a teen choice plan. They're going to want this, so we're gonna build.
Or the
this.
parents are going to want it.
Well, yeah, to live with them.
Yeah.
All right. So this is the example we're going to go down. Okay. Let's go into it. Okay, so at the top right there, that bar, we just illustrated that scenario, so it's always going to be on there on the next few. Okay, so going into it. So we're going to do now a story map, building upon a few layers of this.
So we're in this initial phase, right? We're saying, well, we need to be able to figure out what we need to build in order to build this system, so that we can create this brand spanking new teen choice plan that we think is going to make us $1 bajillion. And because it's telecom, of course, it absolutely will. So we're going to start with, so we've got our 4 layers of our story map. We've got our personas, who are the customers or users of a particular epic or feature. And then the stories themselves being those incremental steps that would be required in order to achieve those goals. Right?
Now, today we're actually just going to go to personas, features, to stories. We're kind of skipping over epics because it's not really relevant for our example, but we know and you guys know that we know this. All right, cool. All right, so we're going to build into this. So from a product manager's point of view, they're trying to define their product catalog within their telecom company, and they would define products and then configure plans for those products.
So we've got 2 initial stories here, right? Makes pretty good sense. They haven't been elaborated. We've just got a couple words on a sticky here. We know that that product managers, they're going to need to be able to define products, right? Absolutely. We also know that they're going to need to be able to configure plans for these products. Again, it makes sense. They need to be able to sell something, right? So we say, okay, well that's what we've got for now. But let's maybe go a little bit broader.
Wait, before we go there, let's just make sure that we're aligned on what products are. So for a telecom company, let's just say something like Rogers. The thing is that they have products. In our example, what we're looking at is mobility would be a product, right? But they can have cable, they can have internet, they can have other sort of major products. Plans go into the marketable instances or what they're actually bringing out from a plan perspective for mobility. Some sort of standardization of a plan that's being marketed out there, right? And that's where that sort of pieces start coming in, okay? Level setting, yeah?
Right. Okay. So essentially, you have 2 plans. You have one that's the Super Saver plan, where you only have a little bit of stuff sold at $25 a month, and you have the Super Deluxe plan that has all the bells and whistles and data you could ever possibly need. but we're going to be charging you through the nose for that one. It's $85. Still the same plan, still the same product underneath, right? We're still selling those telecom services, those mobility services. We're going to be charging different prices for them now.
Okay? So let's keep going on the story map. So let's layer this in. So a customer will be using that product, right? And so the customer needs to agree to that product plan. As well, the customer will conduct chargeable activity. They'll start doing text messages, start making phone calls, all that kind of stuff. And so they're conducting some activity, okay? Then let's go into the next step. So then you go into a billing system, so charge for usage. So we need to calculate, because obviously we want to make some money off of this, right? So you can't just use stuff for free. We're going to calculate the bill, render the bill, and distribute it so that we can tell them that you owe us money off of this.
Yeah, hopefully your teenager didn't go over their 1 gig limit.
Hopefully. Likely. They probably did. All right. So, with some acceptance criteria, now let's layer in some acceptance criteria. Does this, okay, so you guys have probably, since the majority of you guys have done story maps before, you start going into acceptance criteria of your stories or of your features, and you're going into it, and you're really starting to define what will make this acceptable for it to be delivered, right? And so you're really looking at it. And so some of the stuff that started to come up was a product has many prices based on the plan.
So we've had this initial conversation with our business SMEs. We've brought them in and said, hey, can you tell us more about defining these products and configuring plans? And they gave us this information, that a product has many prices based on plans, right? That's their world, that's what they know. And they know that each product price is based on the individual items, right? So we know that you can add on all these different pieces into the product to make it cost more or cost less, right? We also know that each plan as itself has different prices, right? We talked about that Super Saver versus Super Deluxe plan. They all have different prices. So from the business's perspective, this is what these things mean, and this is what it means to be acceptable to them, is that these things must all be true.
And this is clear to them. This is actually quite clear. Whereas from a development side of things, it'd be kind of curious how much you can tease out of that. Let's keep going though. So from a customer side of things, okay, customer contracts are used to agree on product prices. Okay, yeah. When I sign on the dotted line, I agree to product prices, and that's what I'm agreeing to, those terms, right? Also, customers are charged based on their activity and the agreed upon price. Yeah, that makes sense, yeah. Okay, well, but does it? So, really? Products, prices, and plans, but they kind of, how do you work that through? Do you guys get it?
So if we had to now create the tables or create the objects or start to write the code off of, even if we started to dig deeper into this and say, well, this isn't great acceptance criteria yet. Even if we started to dig down that layer deeper, we would still be missing a fundamental piece of this, which is what are these things and how do they connect together?
So coming back to the problem statement, it's all in language. Like the most common challenges is the communication and alignment, right? So what do? Let's all of these terms that start coming up. Like, what is a product? What is a plan? What is an agreement? What is chargeable activity? What is a calculate need? What is a bill?
And we might remember from the beginning there, we all thought we knew what a customer was, right? We had all kinds of different definitions scattered throughout the room. So we as the team probably know, hey, I think I know what a plan is. I think I know what an agreement is. I think I know what a product is. However, if the business has a very different perspective on these things and you're not aligned, that's when you start running into a lot of issues, right? Deliver stories that don't produce the business value that we wanted, bugs, data inconsistencies, all of these things start to pop up if we do not have alignment on what these things are.
So, it begs the question, are we aligned? Because when you're asking one person, they may think of one thing, when you ask another person, they don't think of another thing. So how do we get aligned on this? All right, so what do these keywords mean? And not just what they mean, how do they relate? I'm sure a lot of you guys have done like terminology charts or something like that in glossary of terms and acronyms for this business and throwing them up on a wall just so that people are somewhat understanding what these mean. That's a great level to start with, but at the same time, those become key words. And then, but to go to the next layer of how they relate becomes another element to that, right? So, what can we do about that? Well, let's enter into domain modeling now, okay? So, from that layered architecture, you can sort of see just a high-level view of where that would be. Your domains become the language that becomes used for your applications, for your interfaces that can interconnect also with your infrastructure. You can go to multiple different layers from there. But just getting to that allows you to be able to build on it. So they become, as we mentioned earlier, it becomes a ubiquitous language between business and technical, between business and tech, but with a technical structure, right? So it shows the relationships between interconnected concepts and enables you to reuse acceptance criteria when connecting multiple domains. Okay, that's a loaded area right there.
So yeah, so what that means is that essentially there's always going to be things that are going to be common across many of your stories. Those especially start to pop up when you start doing end-to-end testing, right? You start flowing things all the way through from the start to the end. So for instance, something as simple as field validation, right? Valid fields, they must always only be alphanumeric. There's no SQL injection allowed. There's no crazy special characters. All these things, they're going to be common on almost every single story that you build. So you have a couple different options. Number one is that you can copy and paste those same criteria on every single story that you are going to build, or you come up with a common understanding of what valid field means and visualize that as part of your domain model so that everybody has that understanding.
So I'm sure you guys have seen this before where you're actually repeating the same acceptance criteria or the same sort of thing, story to story to story. That's actually a great evidence of the fact that there's commonalities amongst them, and those commonalities can be teased out in that language to start building, okay? Now, the other thing that's here is also an illustration of a CRC card. If you guys have seen CRC card modeling or anything like that, it's a class responsibility collaborator card. So your top line, that title area is actually a class. The larger box is responsibility, and then that other section is called a collaborator.
So some of you with a little bit of a more development background would probably recognize this as being very, very similar to a class diagram, right? So, that's essentially that technical structure. But now we need to bring in the business language part of this. So instead of this class being the actual objects or the actual entities within our system, the different rows in our table, this is actually going to be a business concept. Okay, so you can see on the left-hand side there, we're going one level above the actual technical implementation and staying just within that business domain.
Okay, now let's go. Well, sorry, actually, here's an actual domain model with the story map on top of it that I actually took, I think yesterday.
Yeah,
But just to give you
hot off the press.
scale it can go. Like it can go pretty far, it can go pretty large. Like the orange and the green, all of that is the entire domain model of how they all interconnect of different concepts. And then you actually have a story map across the top, okay? So, let's move on. Let's go back to our example. For that story mapping with an overlay, given the scenario that we're talking about, although we showed you a little bit of product to customer to calculation, we're going to strip it back because we actually, to build a plan, a team choice plan, we actually don't need to go to the customer yet. We don't need to go to the calculate yet. We actually just need to build it into our product catalog, okay? So we're going to start here.
So we're going to start with just elaborating these two stories. Let's go. So now let's dig in a little deeper into these and see what we can find.
Okay, so pull up that acceptance criteria again,
Okay.
and let's start going into it. So a product has many prices based on a plan. Okay, so let's pull up something. Let's pull up the product.
So a really key point here is that we're looking for nouns here. Nouns and verbs are kind of those key things that you're looking to tease out. So within the story description itself, or within that initial acceptance criteria, look for those nouns and look for those verbs, because those are probably what are going to correspond to these CRC cards that you're going to create. So the first one that we've identified here is a product, right? So we can see here in that first acceptance criteria, a product has many prices based on a plan. So we know that product must be a card. So we take a card, we write product across the top of it, and then we start to define what a product is responsible for.
Okay, so product has a description. What is it, right? Also goes into its price through plans. Well, based on that acceptance criteria, yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? And then we went into another aspect, which we're going to talk about in a second, right? Because we built upon that attribute. Now, based on that, considering it's saying that it's collaborating with a plan, let's pull up a plan card. Let's build a plan card on that, right?
We've identified another one of those nouns, right? We said, aha, plan is something, and we need to define what it is.
It's some level of an entity, right? And so a plan is a price for a product, so it's collaborating back as well, right? It's not orphaned, it is collaborating back to a product. And then we went into, okay, well, into the other parts of the acceptance criteria, it's saying, okay, each product is priced based on individual items. Okay, well, what are those items? priced items. Okay, so there's something coming up there that we're trying to tease out. Well, if we look at our example, back to our scenario, well, if we just looked at just those pieces, you got voice 500 minutes, you got text 3,000 of them, and you got a gigabyte of data. Okay, well, what are those items? Data is one item, text is another item, voice is another item, and those are all part of an overall plan. Okay, so there's some sort of grouping of that. So that goes back into, okay, well, it looks like there's a collection of chargeable items. It looks like there's a collection of items like data, like SMS, text, and voice. So we built another card. This was a language that wasn't actually in the business and tech. They actually decided on building that out based on the conversation that was happening because they needed to normalize what that domain was. And they came up with the term chargeable item for that. And so they said, okay, it has a description, and it is a chargeable service for a product.
So the interesting about this was that this actually introduced a new standard business term as a result of a technical project. Because we uncovered a concept that people have been calling multiple different things at various points in time.
In order to fill the gap that they weren't able to articulate. Through the discussion, they were able to come to this. Okay? Then, well, we also said a collection of, a plan is a collection of price items. Well, what's a price item? Well, a price item is a chargeable item with a price. Okay? Because the service in itself, data in itself, is no different in your systems, but when it's attributed to a price, now it becomes something that is now marketable. And now it becomes something that you can actually add into something that can go. That's a different entity, a different instance of it, right? And so let's start layering that in, because now you've started to work out, teasing out what this is, but now let's add in the connectors of it.
Right.
Okay?
So not only have we identified what the things are and described them through both their responsibilities and who they need to talk to, we also need to define the relationships and the cardinality between them.
Okay, so that open diamond arrow is an owner component to a many relationship of chargeable items. A product must have at least one chargeable item. So it actually could say one ... star to many, right? So, and then just like plan can have, is an owner component to price items. There's no reason to just have text by itself, right? That's not enough. To market it as a plan, you're going to need to bundle it into something that you're going to name and market it out there. So that becomes something that is an instance of. Then you have your chargeable items being, well, a chargeable item is still your unique piece of service, but you can do a many relationship to many different price items because they can be varied in multiple different ways. Like Tyler has a significantly better data plan, which I was talking about earlier with him.
Oh yeah, I got the corporate plan and you got
Shafted.
So,
so he's paying significantly less for his data than I am, and I get less data. That's my sales associate in the company, clearly. So, but from a product side of things as well, it's the same thing. A product in itself, from an ability standpoint, you can do multiple different plans for that same product, right? So it's a one product with to multiple plans.
So by putting in this cardinality here, you can start to identify those many-to-many relationships. And any data people in the room could probably tell you the dangers of those many-to-many relationships and how detrimental they are. But that is also a problem when we're talking about business concepts, right? If we don't have that linking entity that removes the many-to-many relationship, we're going to run into a lot of problems. And that was actually the case with this chargeable item that we essentially created and introduced to the business lexicon. It was because they are having a many-to-many relationship between product and price item.
Okay. Well, now that we got here, well, that story map doesn't make sense. Let's fix it. Right? What makes sense from a sequence of events that's actually going to happen now? Well, our smallest unit is actually a chargeable item. Those individual pieces. When there's new options that are available, like visual voicemail is a new option that has become available, a new chargeable item that is available. Well, I need to be able to define what that is as your first instance. Then I can associate it to a product. Okay? Just like I need to create a price item, and then I can associate it to a plan. Right? It changes the sequence of your story map. And this learning in itself becomes the fact that we're teasing out these domains, we're teasing out these definitions to understand them, identifying the relationships and the interconnectivity between them, and then iterating and going back to our story map to rebuild on the components that we just learned. Right? Okay? Any questions? Cool. Hopefully you guys are good.
Maybe they're holding it to the end, I don't know.
So let's take this to the next level. All right, so we said story maps and domains.
Seeing some scared faces about that one.
All right, so still the scenario up at the top. We said story maps and domains now. Now we're going to say in spec language. Okay, so now we're going to bring in the spec by example, but in spec language first. Okay, so let's look at that. Okay, so given when then is your typical structure of your a spec by example. Given is your precondition or your inputs in a lot of senses. Your when is your trigger. What is the point for it to act, and then is your result of what you're expecting of that end.
So in this initial, you can see that when we talk about spec by example, there's two parts to it. There's the spec and there's the example. We're starting with just the spec part of it essentially make sure that we have that understanding of what the system is supposed to do, just based on natural language. So without getting too deep into the details, but we do want to make sure that we are utilizing those domain concepts that we just uncovered, right? Product, chargeable item, price item, and plan are all things that we've uncovered so far. So we want to make sure that those specific words, and they have to be exact, are the ones that we are using when we are writing our spec.
Because there's no point of you defining a language and then not using it. It has to be agreeable. It has to be amongst your team. And that's why you need to do this with different people all together. You need to get them together to be able to work through this. We'll talk more about that later. But to go back into the example, so given a product manager has authorization to create a chargeable item, when a product manager creates a valid chargeable item with an effective date, then a chargeable item is submitted to the chargeable item list, and the chargeable item becomes available to be assigned to a product.
Awesome. So that gives us that scenario for that first story there, right? Define chargeable item now has this end-to-end scenario that would be associated with it.
Okay, so let's layer on the next story, which is when a product manager creates a product using at least one valid chargeable item, then a product is submitted to the product list.
Good idea. That's something that's missing. Your effective date there, it should be you should have a date expiry somewhere.
Good for you.
It could be, yeah. So in some cases, so we listed that as just being an attribute of the price item card.
Yeah.
However, we could very easily, if we started, for instance, if we started to see that pattern where we're seeing date everywhere on all these different things, that would probably tell us that there's actually a date entity that we can take all of these common components and group them together. So dates always have month, day, year. Right?
Yeah.
So those things, we could now group those up and call that a new card that would say date across the top and have those attributes.
So you would have where it starts and where it ends.
Yeah,
Applied.
whatever
Right.
term you guys use, whether you use active or effective date, whichever one it is, an expiry date, whichever way it is, like that you define as your team, but you're going to start defining it in the different cardinality that you're building as well, right? But yes, going back through, so we got to about here as the second card. Okay, the next one is when a product manager creates a price item and associates it to a plan with an effective date, and the product manager associates the plan with a product, then the plan is submitted to the plan list. It becomes part of that catalog. It becomes available, right?
So we know that the plan can't exist without essentially everything needs to be in place for us to have a plan, right? The plan can't really exist on its own. It needs to have both the product and the price items in there. So that's why those two are kind of lumped together within the scenario. So the cool thing about how we've kind of put this together here is that you'll notice that in these the second and the third blocks, there are no givens in there, right? And the reason for that is that the thens of the previous scenario actually become the givens for the subsequent one, right? So we know that in order to do when a product manager creates a product using at least one valid chargeable item in the second, that the thens from the first one must have already happened. So those thens actually become the givens for the next one.
So depending on what you're doing, if you're writing the spec for a story, you may just stop at the first given when then. And then you may repeat the same given of the then. You may repeat the then to become your given for your next and your next. You can do that if you're writing story specs. Right now, to write it this way, we're actually writing a scenario spec.
Right.
Right?
So this is
goes
end to end.
Through, which allows you to be able to now work through one example and start building your story maps, to build your domains, to build along that scenario, and you'll start building all of your different elements that start coming up to it. Okay? Now, let's take this a step further. That's spec in language. Now let's go to spec by example. Spec by example will now split that and start identifying the variables themselves for those domains.
So instead of just saying authorizations, we actually instantiate what authorization is. So in this scenario, when we run this case through, it's going to be with J. Smith as the product manager ID and authorization type admin, right? Now, if we wanted to add additional cases or additional scenarios or additional variations on that one, we just add another row to the table. And the real great thing about this is that essentially this sets you up beautifully to automate this stuff, right? It's essentially, it's like 90% of the way there, right? And this is before you've even written any code. Because then your developer can take a look at this and say, I can see precisely what the behavior is by looking at the before and the after as part of the example.
And they're being told what, not how. And no developer likes being told how. They all like being able to build on how they want to do something, but they want to know what they need for it. Knowing the preconditions, knowing the trigger, knowing the expected results allows them to be able to construct things the way that they feel is right. But with the commonality between language, with the examples, gives them so much power to be able to actually work with it that you get so much alignment across the board. Continuing this on, it goes into the next, this is the same scenario, just continued onto the next page. The thing is that now with this, if we've worked, a lot of us have worked with multiple different testers, and we've experienced phenomenal ones, and we've experienced some not so phenomenal ones. And
that's putting it nicely.
some of that, but the thing is, it's not up to just the testers in general. It's actually up to the team in so many ways to be able to construct that language, to build things in a way that actually allows us to be able to work together. But with that, the thing is that part of what we've noticed is that a lot of testers will actually look at variations of the same scenario, variations of the same case, variations of the same thing by changing variables. By creating a structure that allows them to be able to communicate in a manner that you can work with overall, you're now just adding rows to those variations, and that's all it is. It's still the exact same scenario, right? Which allows you to refactor, recalibrate, to actually rebuild totally different scenarios, okay?
So if we needed to add negative cases, things like that, cool. Just another row for the setup, another row for the result. If I'm putting in some bad data in this row, then my expected result should be nulls. Great. Bad data here, null data here.
Or if I put a future date and effective date, let's see whether they constructed it right. How that's affected, how that would work. Or it's a past one. How does that work, right? Just adjusting the scenario, adjusting the variables within the scenario allows you to have a hell of a lot more complexity. Okay, let's go. Based on all of those dimensions that you had identified in that spec, your domain just expanded out that much more. We started to talk about authorization. We started to talk about product management. We started to talk about customers, chargeable activity, agreements, calculation methods. We started to look at, if you notice the variables that were back in here, you started to look at calculation methods of tier ranges that were associated to that. Flat. How those start coming in based on a price setting, because it's not good enough to just have $5 as a price for text messages. What is that? Per period, per increment of 1,000, per individual text message? What is it? You need a calculation method that would tie back into that. Those are the types of layers that start going out of this.
So looking at this diagram, you're probably thinking, holy crap, we just did 4 stories, and 1 scenario, and already we have this massive number of cards. But the nice thing about domain modeling is it's not linear. So there's not a linear relationship between the number of stories that you've analyzed and the number of CRC cards that you have within your domain model. It's actually closer to your 80-20 rule. The first 20% of your stories are going to uncover 80% of your CRC cards. So you'll have an initial huge spike. As you go forward and start to add additional stories, what you're primarily going to see is probably just additional attributes that get added. Say, oh, actually, a customer also has an address. Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Doesn't need a new card. It just gets added onto the customer card. That's just an additional responsibility. Or there also may be an additional line. Oh, the customer now needs to be able to know things about our agreements. Okay, well we already have those 2 cards, just another line. No big deal. What that does do is that now allows us to scale this really, really effectively, especially for large enterprise systems, right? They're big, they're monolithic, there's a crap ton of complexity within them. With an approach like this, you can actually get a handle on the complexity a lot easier because the size of the system doesn't matter quite as much.
Okay, this is a glimpse. Let's give you a glimpse.
Yeah, we won't go into the details. I think that's enough of that.
Okay, let's go into the next part of this as well, which is your story map as well. If you mapped out a scenario, you can actually do it in a lightweight manner across your entire system of your story map itself. And we would encourage you to, while you're iterating, to actually do it in a lightweight way of just building out your scenario through the variables, through the expected results of what you're actually doing, using one example all the way through with your actual variables to determine what you're expecting there. That will help you while you are iterating on the domains, on your overall scenario, to expand it out without having to write the full language of it. While you're building the language, it will start building out those domains even more. It will start building out your examples even more. It will start building out your story map even more. So just another glimpse of being able to build those interactively on a whiteboard, on the wall with stickies, rather than going back to computers trying to figure out what all this is as well.
So with this scenario, you're essentially building your end-to-end test just in time. As you do each story, you're building on that scenario to give you everything you need to be able to run something all the way through from beginning to end.
And there are gaps because there are things that you actually don't need, right? For this scenario, that is actually building through. That's a different scenario, by the way. But just trying to show you for where you can go with this. Okay. Now, in summary, iterate. End of the day, just you got to build on this overall. Like just iterate between the 3. You can't just do one in isolation, expecting that you got to do domain modeling by itself. You're going to lose context. You got to go back to your story map. You got to go back to the example, the scenario that you're trying to work through, and build over time, overall with this.
So just in this session today, we started with the story map. We then went down to then picked up a couple stories, went down to the domain model. Once we had figured some stuff out there, we actually realized that our story map needed to be updated. So that came back to our story map. Then from there, we went down to our spec by example, got a little bit more detail there, which caused us to need to update our domain model. So all of these 3 practices link together bidirectionally, and they can't be taken in isolation. Well, they're going to be much more powerful together than if you took them in isolation.
And let's level set a few things. This hurts. It's great. It hurts. Like I've worked with teams where we've spent like a maximum of 2 hours, and just from the facilitator standpoint to jump between all 3 of these things, going back and forth, it's really hard. It's really tiring. It hurts your brain a lot. And also, your teams, they love it. They hate it at first. They start loving it, but at the same time, they can't do more than about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Power to you if you can, but you start getting diminishing returns, right? And also, it's a level set to do like that picture of that domain model. That took months. This is not, and we were iterating and building upon this while we're actually testing and experimenting through our sprints of what our commitments are and all of that. Okay, so it takes time, and you're building over time on it. But your domains start normalizing, your story map starts normalizing, but you start working through the scenarios and the variations and the changes through your MVPs accordingly.
So this is something that essentially you want to bake into your grooming process, right? As stories are coming down the pipeline and becoming closer to when they're ready to be put into code, that's probably the best time to start looking at adding or analyzing it and looking for whether there are additional domain concepts that need to be added to your model or that need to be clarified or things that need to be extended. So in terms of timing, don't try and do it all at once. Build it iteratively as things come down the pipe.
And the best thing is use that one example to build that skeleton. Start building that and just test through that before you start layering, right? But can't emphasize this enough. You cannot do this with just a tech team. You cannot do this with just a business team. You cannot do this with just a little bit of people on traveling, coming back and forth. You need them to come together on this because you need that language to start coming through. We've walked stakeholders, sponsors, SVPs, EVPs through these types of things, and they are hungry for it because they understand it that much better. They're able to be empowered to be part of the conversation and make decisions accordingly. You might want to hold back on some of those people as your initial reaction towards things, but honestly, bring them in because they want to be a part of it. They want to be able to help and guide accordingly, but they don't have the ammo to it. They don't have the language for it because they're talking in one language and you're talking in another. Bring them to it, okay? Okay, that's generally it.
Yeah.
Any questions?
All right. Big deep breath. I know that was definitely a lot. But we'd love to hear any questions that you guys might have, whether it be about the mechanics of how this works, when we do it, how to facilitate, anything like that. One. Excellent.
How do you toggle between doing this, because I think I got from what you said that you do this quite a lot, you do this, how do you toggle between running this physically somewhere and possibly doing it as a standard over time? How durable is it?
Well, the common phrase about radiators and refrigerators, honestly, you want it, well, people talk about documentation all the time. And the thing is that on a wall, it's living and breathing and it's working in progress. These are the types of models and maps that are things that are constantly in progress. And if you have it in a computer, like I get the spec by example sides of things, that would stay more into a computer.
Yeah.
But the other two, if they're not living and breathing on a wall, it actually makes it very difficult to have those conversations in general.
So
version controls and everything else, that's going to kill you.
So one very common behavior that we've seen by having specifically the domain model on the wall, like I know in that picture that Deep put up, it looked like it was very, very large. The nice thing about domain models is that they actually start to segment themselves, right? All these concepts are all interrelated to one another, but they're mostly all over here with their friends, right? There's now another cluster over here. So you can kind of break the model up a little bit if real estate is a concern. But the behavior that we've seen is that team members, as they're building, specifically developers, as they're building the story, they walk over to the domain model to make sure that they understand what the acceptance criteria means when it says a customer or an agreement, things like that. So in order to kind of like make sure that everybody's on the same page, the domain model is hugely valuable to have in a physical form because it's easy to go and look at and point at, as well as update and adjust.
And those aggregate, yeah, sorry, go ahead actually.
Yes, I see that ubiquitous language is something very important at the start of the domain type of design, graphic design. I see that you talk about the Spec language. I know ubiquitous language can handle that we have the same terms about things. I have two questions. What about the Spec language? Is for something that's moved for scenarios? You can see ubiquitous language for entities and Spec language for scenarios. And I see that you didn't talk about what's different between entities and value objects.
We didn't go into each one of those details because we threw up those books, we got 45 minutes, we just wanted to get to showing how they connect because that was the core of what we really wanted to show today. But absolutely, those books will go through a lot of those types of details about entities, about the different connectors, all of that. It will go through all of it, right? And so in this talk we weren't able to, but we do highly recommend you go through and spend the time on that. Now, in terms of the ubiquitous language overall, there were things that you saw in those examples, there were things like words like valid that came up, right? That are going to be across multiple things. You'll start identifying what a definition glossary or a domain glossary would be in terms of common terms even across domains, right? That you would want to be able to just make sure that everyone is on point on. That also starts to expand out as well in your Confluence pages or whatever it becomes to just help to clarify. But it doesn't necessarily need to be an individual domain on there. It's just that when that language is used within an attribute of a domain, it needs to be teased out as well, right? So it starts to expand on that language even more so. Okay? Any other questions? All right, guys. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.